The following is a presentation of the Belly Up Sports Media Network.
All right, episode 211 of the Pesky Report. Here we go. It's just me, your host, Ed Ham, today. We were supposed to have Tim here, and I'm going to be mentioning this all episode. 10 minutes before we started, he flaked out, but that's fine, because I've got a guest that I'm pretty excited about. Sometimes we have guests that I'm excited about and I'm a little nervous about because they've played in the majors or I've seen them at some point in my life and I get a little starstruck. Sometimes, I'm a little more like, whatever. I don't think this guy actually knows more than me. Whatever. Today, I'm just stoked because I've got a gentleman by the name of Jake T. O'Donnell. Jake is somebody who has a Medium account and writes stuff about the Red Sox that I think you're like 100% as far as me agreeing with you. And that is why I retweet you and suggest people follow you a lot, so that when something that gives me a headache happens, they bother you about it instead of me. How are you doing today, Jake?
I'm great, Ed. Thank you so much for having me on. It's great to chat with you in person and not over the Twitter machine, and to talk some baseball and some Red Sox. And we're recording this, Thursday night. The first actual game is less than 24 hours away. Oh man, it's been the longest. It feels like the longest winter. It felt even longer today with all the snow that we got in parts of New England. But I'm psyched. I'm so psyched for the season to start. And I'm psyched to talk to you, and I really appreciate you, plugging me and pushing my stuff. It means a lot. So, and it's great to chat with you,
dude. I've been wanting you on this show since I think November, December, something like that.
Yeah.
You kind of appeared out of nowhere on Twitter. So what's your background? What's your deal, Jake?
What is my deal? That's a lot of people want to know that. So I've been a baseball nut since I was 6. So I go back to 1992 was my first year watching baseball and watching the Red Sox. And I grew up in a small town in northern New Hampshire, and I not a lot to do up there. It's a beautiful area. I grew up in North Conway area. People know it for the ski resorts and things like that. But especially, as a kid growing up there, I kind of lost myself in the sort of world of baseball. And, like I said, 92, the best player on the team was Tom Brunansky. He was my favorite. Butch Hobson was the manager. It was like right after a pretty good era, the late 80s in 1990. And then it was a pretty lean era until sort of Mo Vaughn's heyday, which was like around Mo Vaughn was either a rookie or like his second year on that team in 92. He was rail skinny, if you can believe it. And then, so that's it, but not just the Red Sox, but I just wanted to know everything that there was to know about baseball, and got my hands on every kind of book that I could and VHS videotape. And I wore out a couple of years later when the Ken Burns baseball documentary came out, I wore that out. And I went to my first game that fall in 92 also when I was 6. And so I just have loved the game ever since. I went to school for journalism at UNH. I thought about I wanted to be a sports writer. I ended up going into kind of a community journalism thing, and I've kind of, my career has never really had anything to do with baseball, but I've always written about baseball on blogs and different forums going back to like about 04, 05 when I was in high school. And Twitter was kind of the main outlet in the last 5 to 10 years. And then kind of last summer, fall, I decided that I wanted to get back more into writing long form stuff about the Red Sox, about baseball in general. I kind of felt in a lot of ways like there was like stuff media wise locally that I felt like wasn't being talked about at least in the written form, that I felt like I wanted to be part of it. I wanted to be part of the solution and not part of the problem when it came to informing the fan base about things that are going on. And so I've really appreciated folks like you and a bunch of other, one of the most encouraging things to me over the last 6 or 7 months is like sort of more people have, and again, you've directed more people my way, which I appreciate, is that there's a lot more people that I think are like-minded than I maybe expected, that want to look at this stuff at a deeper level and understand why things are happening, why decisions get made, why the Red Sox make decisions they make, what's happening with players. Why did a player get worse? Why did a player get better? I just love baseball. I've loved the game. I've loved the game since I was 6. I played up through the end of high school too. And that's what the focus has always been for me, is about that. And so I tried to, I started writing in my Medium more at the end of last year, as the season was kind of winding down, and I want to kind of keep doing it and keep going. So that's me in a nutshell. But and again, I'm looking forward to the beginning of the baseball season. Is always my favorite time of year because it's right. My birthday's in April, and it always reminds me of being a kid and the season starting and the snow melting, and it's like we're just right around the corner. And I couldn't be more excited.
Yeah, there's a smell when
Absolutely.
the snow starts melting and the baseball. I have a very vivid recollection, and I swear this happens every year. I think being early March on a Sunday, and I come home and I put on a spring training game, and for 3 hours, everything is hopeful. It doesn't really, because you don't care about who wins or who loses in a spring training game. It's just about the player performance and kind of seeing how guys are doing. And there's in a lot of ways, and this is something that I like about the minors, it really is baseball at its purest.
Absolutely.
And I think,
and in spring training, it's great too, is you get to see maybe your best opportunity. The great thing about NESN is that they've started to show the Woo Sox games all the time, and they're on NESN Plus a lot. But it's great in spring training to get to see some of the younger guys play on games on NESN and stuff like that. So it's like if you don't live in Salem, Virginia, or if you don't live in Greenville or wherever, it's kind of your best opportunity. Or the FCL games, which are hard to go to and see. It's awesome you get to see those guys play, which is cool.
Yeah, no, it's always exciting when you're seeing somebody while they're still developing. And again, the stakes are a little bit lower, last year with Tristan Cassis, it was a little depressing when he got brought up and they were basically out of contention at that point. But, he missed 10 weeks during the regular season. But I can tell you, when he was batting in Worcester, the games that I was at there, the vibes were like watching a major leaguer. It was
awesome.
It was cool. And boy, when he hits the ball, he hits it hard. But something that I really appreciate about your writing, and you described this a bit, is that you do look at things more than surface level, and you also aren't especially reactionary. And I think that that's something that, especially in a lot of journalism now, where it's kind of, you're trying to get a reaction from people to get more views, more clicks. We went to journalism school around the same time, I think. So as well as I do, that it was going from like printed press to the internet, and no one really knew how to make money off of this at the time. And, now that's sort of been, at least from my perspective, it's been much more just trying to find people that agree with you and that are going to give you that immediate, that hit, that reactionary hit. And it's harder to find things that are more thoughtful. It's harder to find things that actually are analyzing the game and not looking at it through Homer glasses, but also not looking at it through, this is what's going to get a response from me. And that's something that I've appreciated about your, I guess I've gone on various things that you've posted on your Medium, and you had a really good lead into the season that I was hoping we could talk about a little bit with the Red Sox, where you kind of just went over the whole roster. What was the process of writing this like?
I appreciate very much all of the things you said. Thank you. And that means a lot, because that is 100% what I'm going for with the stuff that I've been writing. Is just, I want to just understand why things are happening, and like why things happened, what does it say and what's happening next. That's a lot, the stuff that I try to focus on. So I recently wrote 4 posts on my Medium, and it's medium.com/@JakeTO'Donnell. Gotta give that plug in there. And It harkens back to what I did at the end of last season. So it was very obvious to me. I think like after we got through the trade deadline last year, and you got into like August, and it was just like super clear that that the 2022 Red Sox were not going anywhere, that they were going to end up probably around under 500 team, and they were not going to be in the playoffs. I really kind of started to think about like, okay, what's going to happen next season? And it was, I think people that follow this team closely had this offseason circled on the calendar literally for years, because of the fact that it was going to be Chaim Bloom's real first opportunity to really remake the team, that they had a ton of free agents, a lot of money coming off the books, Rafael Devers a year from free agency. So I started to think about it in terms of like, okay, what are the areas that, like, if we look at what's happened this season and where they kind of are going forward, what are the areas that they're going to have to focus on? And they're going to have to address these actual things during the off season. And I'm not sure that people totally appreciate like how much work how much stuff had to get done this off season. And I initially wrote 7 different posts that focused on 7 different areas of the team that they needed to address this offseason. And then I added an 8th one later about the catching situation. Once there had been some reporting from Alex Spear, and Chaim Bloom made some comments that made it sound like they were going to address the catcher situation to a certain degree. So I ended up writing 8 different posts about all of these things that I felt like they needed to do. And I went and looked at the free agents that would be available, the guys that the Red Sox had that were going to be free agents, and then also potential trade candidates for each of those different spots. And if I could think of it from memory, basically the first of the 8 was the Devers extension. So that wasn't necessarily like about addressing something outside the team, but it was the Devers extension. It was that outfield situation. I looked at both starting pitching from an in-house perspective and an external perspective, because those two things seemed a little bit separate in my mind. And obviously how things ended up playing out, they ended up going more with internal options. And then I looked I looked at DH and shortstop, and then also the bullpen. And then again, later on, catcher. So I wrote a few posts as things happened during the winter, and then I realized, I figured, okay, let's assess, let's look back and see how they addressed those 8 different things that they needed to try to address this offseason. And almost kind of, I kind of graded myself a little bit. I was like, this is, and what's kind of funny is like 2 of the things that they ended up doing were things that I just mentioned in passing. Like I mentioned the name once, and that's what they ended up doing. That was Kluber and your guy Alfaro. And and then the one that I nailed was the bullpen one, where I was like, I listed, at least for the right-handed pitchers, I was like, there's 5 guys that they should go after for like end of the game bullpen roles for right-handed pitchers who are free agents. I would have been thrilled if they signed one of them. They ended up signing 2 of them. So it was obvious that was an area that we knew that they needed to address, considering how bad the bullpen was last year. So I just went through each of those and just looked back and said, okay, what did they actually do in regards to the stuff that I thought that they should do? And what's interesting to me in looking at it is that they ended up addressing all of the areas in one way or another. Some of them, it was very minor, like with the catching situation, all they did was bring in Alfaro on a minor league deal. With going outside in starting pitching, all they did was sign Kluber, but they didn't do anything else. The shortstop situation, effectively, all they ended up doing was trading for Mondesi, but like also there was a lot of other things that happened. Like you could almost argue that signing Duvall was the shortstop thing, because of the fact that allowed them to move Kike to shortstop, and with Story being out. And obviously, they signed Yoshida. Obviously, they signed Devers. That was the biggest thing. And then the bullpen was where they did the most work. So they ended up actually doing all of these things. There weren't really a lot of other moves that happened. The only other thing was I didn't include first base, because I figured at the time, I think we all kind of figured like it's Costas' job to lose. The thing I don't think we totally expected going into the offseason was that they wouldn't even wait around on Hosmer, that they would just DFA him and let him go. And effectively anoint Costas and give him the job. So that was just how I approached those the 4 most recent posts that I did, and I posted the most recent one, the bullpen and catcher one, on Tuesday, I think, this week. So that was how I decided to kind of look at the offseason, comparing what I wrote back then to what they actually ended up doing.
Yeah, and it's very thorough. Like if you haven't read it yet, you do yourself a favor. It's pretty interesting. You don't necessarily have to agree with it, but it's a very thorough analysis of how this offseason went down. Now how did you end up grading it? How do you think the Red Sox performed with their offseason acquisition?
Yes. So I think that I've said a version of this on Twitter before, which is that this is going to make me like I'm not sure how to say it, like just not fun, I guess, the lame person at the party. Like, I just am not into giving an off-season grade until after the season has happened, because I don't know how you can grade. Like, if you're asking me, like, do I feel like they went out and addressed the positions that they needed to address? Like, in one way or another, they pretty much did. I think that, like, if you look at like last offseason, if you want to do that, like, and say, okay, how did they do going for 2022? I think you kind of have to give the previous offseason probably like at best like a C-, maybe even a D+.
I would go D on that. When you look at, like, what was the big move? A Story?
Well, it was Story, but it's like everybody knew going into the season that the bullpen wasn't good enough, and that everybody also knew that you were really having your fingers crossed with Jackie Bradley, and there were troubling signs in the playoffs with Dahlbeck, and it was just like, there was stuff, and there were a lot of different reasons for it. It was a very strange offseason. It was not a typical one, but they just did a lousy job. So I would say that I'm happy with the offseason. I think that they went out and got they signed Devers to the long-term extension, which I said was the most important thing. They got it done. It was a great deal for both the Red Sox and Devers. They have locked in their franchise player for the next 11 years. No, you can't complain about it. Maybe it felt like it dragged on longer than it needed to. I think that after the Bogarts thing happened, they decided to make that the priority, and they got it done. And you have to applaud them for that. I think that they added a guy, and maybe we'll get into some of the lineup stuff, but they clearly needed somebody at the top of the order to help set the table, whatever that was. And they feel like Yoshida is going to be that guy. And a guy that is going to make contact and kind of set the tone for the lineup. They needed that. So they got that. They wanted a DH who had some positional flexibility that also could have some power and get on base and kind of do some of the stuff that JD Martinez didn't do last year. They got that with Justin Turner. And not only that, he's like a major sort of tone setter, clubhouse leader type guy himself. And I think that, I'm disappointed about what happened with the starting pitching. I write this in my piece that it was the area that I felt like if you had a do-over on the offseason, that's probably the number one thing that I wish could have gone differently. Is the only thing they really end up doing is kind of elevating some guys, elevating Whitlock and saying he's going to be in the rotation, and Bayo and going with him. And then the only guy that you got from outside the organization was Kluber, who is great. And he wants to be here clearly. And he had his best season in a long time last year. He seems like he's figured out a way to manage his injury history. But it kind of just leaves you a little bit, it's like, okay, like, it would have been great if they could have made a trade and brought somebody in. But I've said this all winter that making trades this past offseason was next to impossible. And the Red Sox, it turned out, were not in the best position to be able to make trades unless they wanted to trade guys off of the MLB roster, which they did do for the trades that they made. They did trade Josh Taylor and they did trade Matt Barnes to make trades. But I think that they probably went into the offseason thinking to themselves, like, we're going to trade a Nick York or an Edinson Paulino, or we'll put Wickelman Gonzalez in a trade or whatever, and we're gonna get a pitcher or an outfielder or somebody that's gonna have term on their contract 4, 5, 6 years, and plug them in, and that's gonna be we're going to be all set. And that didn't end up happening for a variety of reasons, because it just didn't seem like any team, even rebuilding teams, wanted guys that were that low level of the minors. So that's my biggest disappointment, is I wish that they could have been able to do more there. But I think that given the needs that they had, all the different areas they needed to address, they got the Devers thing done, and they addressed the holes adequately enough that I think reasonable people are looking at this current team and saying, this is a team that could possibly be in it at the end of the season in September. And so I'm fine with the offseason. I like where the roster is, and the Story thing was a bummer, but that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with I think that they recovered really well from the Story injury in terms of the moves that they made in the aftermath of that. So that's my long meandering answer, is that I'm not going to give a letter grade. That makes me boring, but I'm happy with the offseason. I'm happy with what they accomplished, and I like where the roster is right now.
So I think that it's a very valid point that you're making with this, but I do want to push back a tiny bit on the pitching. And there's a factor that you're not really including with it, and that's James Paxton optioning in on his deal, and then going from having him last year at $10 million kind of to just rehab for the whole season. Now they get him back at $4 million, so that's one option there that's looking to be on the 40-man. And then you also have Brian Mata, a year removed from his Tommy John. Now he's at AAA. That's Brayan Bello before Brayan Bello had moved up as far as potential goes. You've got a healthy Brandon Walter on the 40-man. You've got more options internally, which is something that you talked about. But my issue with their offseason has been with the infield depth. And it's not, I don't have a problem with Hernandez playing shortstop. I don't have a problem with them trading for Mondesi. I don't have a problem with Arroyo starting. I don't have a problem with them getting Yu Chang. I do think they're missing one guy there to kind of hold it all together, because when you look at the four guys that I mentioned, they all have fairly lengthy injury histories, especially Mondesi and especially Arroyo. Chang, I like Yu Chang. I think more than a lot of the people who reacted when they got him. I think he's solid defensively. He has way more power than people give him credit for. And he hit 9 home runs in one season. Yeah. But they just don't have that proven option that you can stick there and, like he'll play 4 days a week. I thought Jose Iglesias, who is still a free agent, would be very good for that role. I liked him a lot more than Elvis Andres, but it seems like this is the direction that they're going. And if they had somebody in AAA that was a little closer, then I would say fine. But Cedar Rafaela and David Hamilton haven't played a game above AA yet. The only other real option they have there that can play shortstop is Nico Goodrum, who kind of flamed out the last couple of years. He's fine as far as depth goes, but if one of those guys go down, you're suddenly in a bit of a pinch there. So that I think that I'm a little less into that than with the starting pitching, just because I also think that the bullpen will improve the starters regardless. Yeah. And you've got Sale back going into the season, which, fine, maybe he gets hurt again, but you've got enough options there that I feel a little more comfortable with that than I do the shortstop depth. But, that's that's the difference there. I'm curious though, if you factor where you factor Paxton into all this.
So, I want to touch on both of those things. I think that Paxton is like one of these things where it's like it's not going to hurt the Red Sox much either way, whatever happens, because they have the depth. The fact that he opted in for $4 million in hindsight remains probably one of the most shocking things that happened the entire offseason, because it sounded like he was comfortable with the training and medical staff. He liked what was going on here, and he wanted to stick it out. He wanted to see what was going to happen. He could have made a lot more than $4 million on this past free agent market, as long as he could prove that he was healthy. And so far he's been pitching like everybody else in camp. It doesn't seem like he has a lot of limitations. They might be bringing him on a little bit more slowly, but he seems fine to me. You make a good point about the depth, and that is something I don't disagree with, is that the Red Sox have built a lot of starting pitching depth, which is a huge deal in the current sort of landscape of baseball and the direction things are going, where I think that most teams are recognizing that they need 6 to 7 viable starters in order to get through the season. And I think that the Red Sox have done a very commendable job of building up that depth. And that's where I agree with you about Brian Mata and Brandon Walter and Chris Murphy. And I think that those guys will all play factors this year. And I think that's commendable. The only point that I'm making is that it goes back to the Kluber thing, where it's like, that Kluber spot, I just wish had been upgraded with somebody that I felt, because no matter what we're talking about with this rotation, it's all guys who there are question marks from an injury and durability standpoint, except I guess for Nick Pivetta. But even he's had, last year notwithstanding, he's had health issues in the past. So that's the only thing I'm saying is, like, if you, and there were, the sort of high end of the pitching market was not realistic. The best pitcher who was actually traded this past offseason was probably Pablo Lopez, right? Like, I can't really think of, and he would have been a great fit, but also, who are the Red Sox? Like, the Red Sox didn't have a Luis Arias level hitter on
Miami
the Major
wanted
League roster.
Casas.
Right, and they wanted Casas, and that was never going to happen. They were especially not going to trade him for a guy with 2 years of service time left. So that's my only thing, is that I wish that there was another guy in the rotation that you could point to and say, I'm going to get 180 quality innings out of that guy. But that is possibly the road that the Red Sox are looking down this year. Is it's like, if we get to the playoffs, if the Red Sox get to the playoffs this year, we're going to be happy and we might be mildly surprised, but it's like, they're not going for it. So I guess I understood it from that standpoint. As far as the middle infield situation goes, I'm guessing that after Story got hurt, they made the conscious decision that they wanted to try to make up his offense as much as they could. So that's when they went out and signed Duvall, as opposed to deciding to spend the money on another on a middle infielder of somebody like who based off of who was available at the time. Realistically, it doesn't seem like the Correa thing was ever happening. And so they went out and they got Duvall, who was the best sort of power hitter on the market that they could get at a reasonable number. And they elected in the short term, I think, to kind of just roll the dice a little bit with the middle infield stuff. As far as like the health goes, yeah, there's questions there. I think that clearly Kike is game to be the everyday shortstop, and Christian Arroyo, I feel like, has been waiting for this opportunity his whole entire life to be able to be a starting middle infielder in MLB. I think that where I have concern is that we could, because of the shift rules going away, I think that Kike and Arroyo are both good defensively, but I just worry that we could be like May 1st and we could just be like, this isn't working. The flip side of that is that if Story comes back and you have Mondesi back at some point too, late in the season, it could be a 180 where you're like, holy crap, we have the best defensive middle infield possibly in baseball, or one of the best ones, if those two guys are healthy and playing. So I think that the sense I get is that they are going to just try to ride out the situation that they have with those guys until the guys that they expect to have be part of that middle infield mix come back. And they didn't want to extend themselves for, even $3 million for Andrews. Obviously, they could still sign Iglesias if they wanted to, bring him in on a minor league deal. There's nothing stopping them from doing that. I think at this point, that's probably not going to happen because of Chang. So I think that what you're saying about the middle infield part makes a lot of sense, and those questions exist everywhere on the roster, and it is kind of I go back to what we were saying. Like, I still think definitely an 85 to 90 win team. But there is huge variance. It's the team that has, the Red Sox have like probably the widest variance of outcomes of just about any Red Sox team I can remember going into a season. But I think that given age, experience, like the sort of the fact that the fact that the injury luck was so bad last year, I just kind of can't believe that it's going to all go wrong again this year. It could,
Yeah,
but yeah,
in
there's
in
questions up and down the roster. That
yeah, in
is
a
a
lot
fact.
of ways, 2021 team got very lucky with injuries, and the 2022
Right.
team, it was like everything that could have gone wrong did, and like their name was Milwaukee.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
it's funny that you mentioned the starter because going into the offseason, the guy that I wanted more than anybody else for the Red Sox to sign was Chris Bassett, who
Yeah.
I really thought would have fit into that, just workhorse, top of the
Yeah.
rotation guy. But as soon as that, as soon as they mentioned that they probably weren't going after anybody that had a qualifying offer, it was like, okay, well, how are they going to pivot from this? Do you think that it was a mistake for them this offseason not to be willing to sacrifice the draft pick for somebody?
No, I don't think that was the mistake. The mistake was being over in the first place. Like once they were over, once they ended the season $4.5 million over the luxury tax, I think that that made the decision for them that they were not going to look at this offseason as the offseason to um as the offseason to give up draft picks, give up 2 picks to sign to like maybe the only guy that was a free agent this past offseason that I think the Red Sox would have maybe should have considered giving up the picks for was probably like Trey Turner, but it didn't see it seemed like Trey Turner was going to Philly. Like that was like seemed like that was like predetermined, especially after he got offered more money by the Padres and turned it down. It was like that was like seemed like that was a fait accompli that he was going there. So I think that, and again, this is maybe the longest Medium post that I wrote in the off season, was an examination of kind of how the Red Sox got to the point of being over the CBT and with the implications both um, from a draft standpoint, like this upcoming draft, like what going over meant in terms of of losing Bogarts and Eovaldi, how the picks were worse, and how in turn the draft pool money was worse, and then also the implication of, yeah, if you're going to sign a qualifying offer free agent, you have to give up a second and a fifth as opposed to just a second. So I would not have given up 2 picks to sign Chris Bassett. I don't think I like Chris Bassett. I think he's a good pitcher. My own personal opinion is I would have rather. I think the case that I had made was that if you look at his 2022 and Nate Eovaldi's 2021, Nate was better. So if you bank on Nate having better health, I would have wanted to have Bassett instead of Eovaldi. And I definitely think that a guy, if you didn't have to give up if you're giving up the second pick and you were getting other picks back, if you're getting 2 picks back for like letting Bogarts and Eovaldi go, and you're netting 2 picks that way. And if you were only giving up 1 pick, I could have seen a scenario where a guy like Bassett probably would have been a perfect fit, because he was durable at least last year. It's a similar thing where he's had injury stuff in the past, but durable guy, somebody that you could count on for that. And we have seen an example of. And I outlined this in the piece that I wrote, that the Red Sox the Trevor Story signing is proof that they're willing to give up draft picks to sign qualifying offer guys. But there was special circumstance where they had netted an extra pick for the 2022 draft because of, well, they got 2 extra picks, but basically they were net of 1 after signing Story because they got 1 for Erod, and they also got 1 because they didn't sign Judd Fabian. So, it's the same thing this past offseason, where if they knew they were going to potentially lose both Bogarts and Eovaldi, and they only had to give up 1 pick, maybe they do sign a guy like Chris Bassett. So, and I outlined this in the piece about how the decision to stay over the luxury tax had sort of long, and you get accused of this too. I get accused of this, of being this, like, somebody that is always, supportive of the front office, and
Illuminati.
they really, yeah, I don't like that term, so I don't say it, but they really screwed this up. Like this shouldn't have happened. Like, but the thing that's interesting that maybe makes me a little bit different is that I go back to the offseason prior. I don't necessarily talk about the deadline last year because I don't think it was realistic that they were going to have a full sell off at the deadline. There's a school of thought now that people think that the Red Sox should have just dumped JD Martinez and his entire salary and not gotten anything back. That was never happening. They were
With
never
2 games
going
back,
to do that.
no, it wasn't
No.
going. People forget that they were still in it at that point, even
Exactly.
if it seemed unlikely.
Right, and they were getting guys back from injury too. That was another thing. Like they didn't make a bullpen move or they traded away Diekman, which was an addition by subtraction for the bullpen because they were getting Matt Barnes back that week. Like they were not going to do this full on sell off. The issue goes back to the offseason before where, and again, I wouldn't say that the way to avoid it was to not sign Story. I'm glad they signed Story. I still believe in him. I think that with the getting the last year out of the way, hopefully we see him this year, but there's potentially 5 more years on that contract. I think it's going to pay off eventually. I go back to, the Renfroe trade where, you're trading him and getting prospects back, but you're also taking on enough salary that was what ended up pushing you over the tax. Couldn't you have traded Renfroe to another team that was willing to take on his whole salary, and get prospects that maybe were not necessarily as good as Ben Ellis or Hamilton, but just clear the salary and then sign somebody sign another outfielder for under what Renfroe was. It's written in my piece. I haven't thought about this in a while.
And that was such a strange move looking at that retrospectively too, because it was right. Remember, it was right before they went into the lockout.
Literally an hour.
Yeah, and I almost wonder if they were planning on signing someone like, say, a Suzuki or somebody like that, and they were just too slow to the draw once like the frenzy started.
Exactly.
Players started signing again because that was pretty glaring. And yeah, Jackie Bradley, maybe he could have bounced back. He was one of the better players on the team in 2020. I mean, not that the bar there was high, but he had a good season and just an absolute disaster of a 2021. So a rebound wasn't exactly out of the cards, even if they were overpaying for him. But it does, I mean, that kind of connects a little bit with what I was saying about shortstop, where it felt to me like they ended up cutting the corners a little bit in right field. Like maybe they could have gotten a Tommy Pham or something like that earlier just to hold things together there. It almost feels like they're doing that again with the infield, not to the same extent because at least, they have all the starters right now, but just from a depth perspective. Do you think that do you think that the middle infield health-wise, they have enough there that they can withstand an injury or two?
I mean, so to your question, so I think that's kind of your big question. It's like, okay, so yeah, if you game this out, it's like shortstop is the tough one because I think they have enough guys that could play second base if something happens with Arroyo. Like you could probably plug Chang in there and you'd be okay. If Kike gets hurt and Mondesi's not back, then you're in a really tough spot with the shortstop position. That I completely agree with. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if you would just bite the bullet and go for defense and like just bring Rafaela up and see how he does against big league pitching for a couple weeks just to tide you over as long as it's not a long-term injury. Chang can play shortstop. He's not great at it. Same thing with Arroyo. Arroyo can play shortstop. Bobby Dahlbeck can play shortstop. He started a game at shortstop last year. I don't think Emmanuel Valdez can play shortstop. Like I don't know that you're gonna. I don't know that you're gonna add Christian Koss to the 40-man to have him play shortstop. Like I just don't. So I agree with you. Like but I think that this is the risk that they have decided to take. The other thing that maybe we're discounting is that again, they have been really cagey about where Mondesi is health-wise. And I've heard there's been conflicting things over the last week where basically like maybe it was about a week or so ago. Cora said that, they don't have a timetable and he's not really doing baseball activities and we're not really sure where he's at. Well, that makes you think that he's going to be out for a while longer. And then I think today Cora had some quotes talking about how he saw Mondesi running and he said he looks athletic. And the word that he used to describe how he looked was explosive. So that makes me think maybe he's not that. Maybe he hasn't hit yet and he still hasn't really done baseball activities. Maybe he'll be ready in mid-April. Maybe it's only a couple week thing. I don't know, because by late April he'll be a year out from the surgery, I think. So that could be part of their calculus too, is that they're just thinking, okay, we need to write it out a few weeks and then we'll have Mondesi on the roster and we don't have to play him every day. We can work him in as a defensive replacement or a pinch runner late in games. And that's going to be our guy, who's going to be like the guy who's the backup. But again, you do run into the same issue with him where he is a major injury risk because he has had such a hard time staying on the field in his career. But I think if he's I ideally view Mondesi as the last guy on the bench, as the 26th guy who is like in the current game where infield defense is being, or metal infield defense is being emphasized and base running is being emphasized. I love having Mondesi on the team if he's healthy. I think that could end up stealthily being a huge move. I had it in my piece about like just that he, just his stolen base numbers. If you do like the 162, like if you average it out over, Mondesi has 60 stolen bases per 162 games in his career, and if he had been healthy for 162 games each of the last 5 years, he would have led MLB. Those would have been the most steals in all of MLB for each of the last 5 years. But that is obviously that's not realistic, but it's also shows you how athletic and talented he is, and the fact that he has had ACL surgery. I don't know. It could kind of cut both ways, where it's either maybe he's not the same guy or it helps him. So.
Yeah, really the definition of high risk, high reward there with
with
a lot of, I mean, Mondesi, I think, is like the epitome of it. But, just a lot of guys on this team, which it kind of is exciting to think about that some of these guys might actually, be something that, did we freeze?
No, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I think it might have frozen on my end for a second.
Okay.
But this is going to be a totally different subject change, but we have to go into this because it's been the big story the last 2 days, and I think you know where this is going.
Yeah.
Noah Song. For those that haven't been following what I can only describe as the biggest headache of the last, of an off season full of headaches for me.
A lot
personally.
of headaches.
I think this one's been the worst. So with what I do with Sox prospects, I'm running the social media, so I get a lot of people for the last 2 years that I've been doing it. Oh, and Noah Song updates, and every the amount of these every week. So when he got picked up in the Rule 5 draft, I thought, finally, I'm done with this because he's going to be in the Air Force for however long. Like, good, I don't have to think about this anymore. And then
not so much.
The news that he has been given his release. He's allowed to play baseball again. He's now 3 years removed from throwing a pitch, but he's with the Phillies. And, I never thought I was going to have this many arguments about how the Rule 5 draft works, but here we are. What are your thoughts on Noah Song right now?
I'm totally with you that it just is a part and parcel of, I talked about before, like, how I feel like what I want to get out of like the media of the people that have the access to the team and the people that have like the biggest platform to talk about the team, the stuff that I want. You talk about being reactionary. The reaction to what happened yesterday was, to use a word that went around quite a bit yesterday, it was embarrassing. It was quite embarrassing. It was an utter embarrassment. A lot of it, the reaction to it, the fact that today we find out that when Noah Song found out that he was being discharged, he went and threw a bullpen with a high school team in Jacksonville, and He said that it was like having to learn how to walk again. And so I'm supposed to believe that this guy is going to make the 26-man roster of a team that is trying to win the World Series this year. And again, this was predictable that Noah Song has not picked up a baseball and has not thrown off of a mound in 3 years. That last week was the first time he threw off a mound in 3 years. It's just, and yeah, the local reaction to it, talking about how, Dave Dombrowski is this evil genius and he's going to stick it to the Red Sox for the sole purpose of just keeping this guy on the roster because he's mad at John Henry. Like it's absurd. I am, as far as what the Red Sox should have done in this case, I think maybe you're a little bit more up on some of the rules and machinations and different things that could have happened and should have happened, whatever. What I think it all really boils down to is that if the Red Sox wanted to keep him, they were at some point going to need to put him on the 40-man roster before the Rule 5 draft. And they could have put him on, I guess they could have put him on and then taken him off and put him on the military leave list, and they wouldn't have had to worry about this, I guess. I think that is incredibly oversimplified to describe it. And I don't know, do people think that like running a Major League Baseball franchise is as easy as running a fantasy baseball roster? Like, I don't get it.
They definitely think that.
They definitely do. So that a team just has like 40-man roster spots lying around, and you're just going to give a 40-man roster spot to a guy who hasn't pitched in 3 years? Like, do you listen to do these people listen to themselves when they talk? Let me put it I'll put it in these terms. And you mentioned yesterday, I think you tweeted about Chris Murphy and how he was on that same Lowell team with Noah Song. He had like the same ERA. He pitched twice as many innings. And they were drafted the same year. I think Song was a 4th-round pick, and I think Chris Murphy was a 6th-round pick.
That's correct.
They both went to college, and they were both college pitchers. But think about the difference between Noah Song and Chris Murphy. Now, Noah Song, thank you to Noah Song. Like, he went to the Naval Academy. He went to flight school, and I think we all appreciate his service and everyone's service. And that was his choice to do that. And I think he wanted to play baseball, and he applied for the waiver and he didn't get it, that kind of thing. But if we're just looking at it from a baseball standpoint, Chris Murphy has pitched with the Red Sox for the last 3 years. He was part of the offsite thing in 2020, but then he pitched in the minors in 2021 and 2022. He earned a spot on the 40-man roster by pitching as well as he did. And the Red Sox had some hard decisions to make. The Red Sox had, this is the other part of this, is that the Red Sox they lost other guys in the Rule 5 draft who
Thad Ward, AJ Politi,
the guys who are probably actually going to pitch in the big leagues. The Red Sox are probably actually going to lose those guys. But like a guy like Noah Song, who doesn't pitch for 3 years, you're supposed to protect him over like these guys who have put the work in, who have been there for the last 3 years to earn a 40-man roster spot, which is the thing that they have been working their whole lives and their whole careers to get to. What kind of message would that send to the guys that are in the Red Sox minor league system, who have sweated it out on the buses and driving out, going to pitching in Altoona, Pennsylvania, and Great Falls, Montana, or wherever the hell these guys go? Those guys work their asses off to get to this point. And I'm not denigrating Noah Song in any way and the choices that he made in his life and what he had to do. But I just think that it's ludicrous to think that the Red Sox are going to give up a 40-man roster spot when they've had a crunch all winter and they also had really hard decisions to make about the 40-man, and give it to Noah Song, who hasn't picked up a baseball in 3 years. And then we find out today that, again, he was like, throwing a baseball for him off a mound was like having to learn how to walk. So I think that at the end of the day, he is hopefully the best case scenario is that he ends up back with the Red Sox. And if he wants to do this and he wants to pitch and he still has the talent, we can see where he's at, and they can probably keep him in Florida, keep him in the complex, and see what happens with him. But this idea that like the Red Sox screwed this up in some way, it's from going back to the Rule 5 decision, and also what's happened over the last couple of days, that the Red Sox somehow screwed this up. It just doesn't make any sense, Ed.
It's people that are it's a hammer in search of a nail.
Yes.
They don't care the reason. They just want to hate on something and they want to complain about it, and that's fine. Like, people get their own motivation and enjoyment out of things for whatever reason. But it does bring on a question, and that's, why did Dombrowski even take Song in the first place?
I think that I do think it was two reasons. I do think part of it was, I think he did want to get back at the Red Sox, but also I definitely do think that he thought that he drafted Noah Song and he saw his talent and he was like, okay, this guy's available. I want to take him.
Yeah,
so
he took Cam Cannon the round in the minor portion of the draft.
Cam Cannon might as well have not played the last 3 years. But again, we talk about Dealer Dave and his brilliant drafting. That's one of his worst picks, I would say. But yeah, so he took him too because it was a name. He was like, okay, I know that guy. What's interesting to me is it does seem like these guys, like the guys that are in charge of the team, are making the Rule 5 picks, because that could very easily be something that he would delegate out to Sam Fuld, who is his general manager. And I'm not sure that Sam Fuld would have been super thrilled about taking a guy who hasn't pitched in 3 years in the Rule 5 draft. That pick was 100% Dombrowski.
Oh, 1,000% Dombrowski. Some of the trades with the minor league stuff too, because he's done this before with like CJ Chatham trading Victor Santos.
That was another one. Yeah. So I think that, why did he take him? Yeah, I think he thought he was talented. It's a Rule 5 pick. There's not really any risk for him. I also do think that the Phillies were not anticipating him getting his waiver this year, because I think the rules would be different next year. My understanding is that they would have only need to keep him on the roster for 90 days after a full year of being on the military list. So I think that this is kind of, I don't want to say it's backfired on the Phillies, because it's, again, for them, it's not a big deal. Like, they don't, they're not, they're trying to win the World Series this year. They have a stacked team. They have a stacked roster. It doesn't matter to them very much. It's just the hubbub about this was just an effort to try to spin anything that is negative about the Red Sox into an abject disaster and a reflection on Chaim Bloom's alleged incompetency, and that's most of what this was about. But betraying a lack of knowledge about how roster building in Major League Baseball actually works. 40-man roster spots do not grow on trees. That's ultimately what it comes down to.
No, they do not. And it's one of those things that frustrates me more than anything else with the media cycle and how Twitter operates. If the sky is always falling, it's never falling. And
right.
We see that a lot, because, every single move that happens is an abject disaster. And there have been, listen, there were moves this offseason that I wasn't thrilled with. There were moves that I really liked. Losing Trevor Story to that injury was bad. That was objectively a really bad thing for this team. That's like their second best, at least as far as proven hitters go.
Yeah.
That was not a good thing. But the reaction to so many other things, it loses that effect.
Exactly. Right.
No, outrage.
That's a great point. The stuff that we're talking about with the going over the CBT, there's like a legitimate gripe and saying, okay, that's something that both sets the team back in terms of their signing free agents and also the quality of players they can select in the draft. Like, that was a $4.5 million decision that is probably going to end up costing the team a lot more than that. That's a legitimate thing to criticize the team over. But you're totally right that if you complain about everything, then you lose the sight of the stuff that you probably really should actually be complaining about.
Yeah, and that got lost also. Sorry to keep adding on this, but oh my God, it was infuriating where this thing that was objectively a blunder by the team happened, and everyone's just whining about trading Jay Groom.
Right.
No offense to Jay Groom, who I am, he's still on the 40-man there. Interesting prospect.
Yeah.
But he was, they weren't going to be able to keep him. He was the most obvious guy to go just because of that 40-man spot. They weren't going to be able to sneak him through waivers.
Exactly. Yeah. And Groom pitched he pitched pretty well for the Padres after that trade. And and you're talking about a GM that knows a guy. It seemed like the sense in that draft was that Preller was hoping that Groom would fall to the Padres, because And so he wanted that guy. But it's the same thing where it's like, yeah, Jay Groom. Like I remember that there was like a Rosenthal report talking about that. And Rosenthal is not he has to cover everybody, so he doesn't know the ins and outs of every team. But he kind of effectively said that Corey Rozier and Max Ferguson did not equal Jay Groom, even if you take the Hosmer part out of it. And that's just objectively not true. Like it's just, to me, like, I don't like, not that I necessarily think Ferguson and Rozier are going to be like these world beating, all-star level players, but they're both talented. Max Ferguson was a really good player in college. Like, and I think Max Ferguson, I don't know which one of them is like really fast. Is like a 75, 80.
Rozier's pretty fast. They're both they both have a lot of stolen bases. I think Ferguson stole like 40 or something like that. But Rozier's a good contact hitter, and he's one of these guys that can hit the gaps pretty well, plays decent defense.
Yeah, so it's just objectively not true to just be like that like Groom was so much better than at where Groom was in his career, as opposed to what the potential upside is for those two hitters. And again, people use that as a chance to knock the Red Sox, and it just wasn't, it's everybody can have their opinions about prospects and players and stuff like that. But like you said, they were not going to keep Jay Groom. He was going to be removed from the 40 man to make room for the guys like Brandon Walter and Chris Murphy, and ultimately like David Hamilton and Rafaela and those guys. He was not sticking around. They knew what they had with him. And so you might as well move on from him. These are the decisions that teams have to make, because of the fact that there is a finite number of roster spots that you can give to these guys. And, making trades to try to clear up a 40-man crunch that's part of the job. And you can't, and again, you can't just give that spot to a guy who who hasn't pitched in 3 years, just because of the fact that in 17 innings and then in an international tournament, he looked great 3 years ago and hasn't pitched since then. You just can't do it. You just can't do that.
Yeah. And we're not, this isn't also, we're not just like shitting on Noah Song. Like no, of course not. But he hasn't pitched in 3 years. Anybody having not pitched in 3 years is going to, you don't have that spot for them. But it's interesting that you mentioned that as far as the roster building, because something that I think has been lost this offseason that I've really appreciated when it comes to the 40-man crunch is the moves that they've been able to make with guys like Franklin German and Matt Barnes, where they got with German, they got effectively a similar pitcher that isn't on the 40-man that they can kind of rewind the clock on in Theo Dellinger, who, by the way, also a blacksmith, which is cool. But,
the blacksmith, yes.
And who made an axe or whatever on it. Like he has a bat that's also an axe that he
made.
Like it's just cool, but he also, throws 98 mile an hour feet, which is what German could do. But then also with Barnes, you were able to take a guy, and they didn't end up dropping a huge amount of money or anything. It was an even split, but they needed a lefty, and they have a lot of righties, and they got somebody that's a change of pace lefty, I think, in Richard Blyer that really fits what the team's strategy is right now as far as strike throwing and pitching to weak contact. And moves like that from DFAing those guys instead of having to, and kind of being creative with acquiring these. I don't know. I think that moves like that are underappreciated when the flashier moves like Rafael Devers getting an 11-year extension, which, by the way, awesome. Like that move cannot be appreciated enough. We've talked a lot.
You have to do both. You have to make both of those kinds of moves. That's 100%.
Definitely. Now, we've talked a lot about, just stuff like gripes that we've had with the offseason and weaknesses and stuff like that. And we're almost at the hour mark. And I know before we did this, I was like, we're going to shoot for an hour. But I think it's important that we talk about a little bit about what we've liked as well, because so we're going to go a little bit over that line. If you have a strict hour limit, stop listening in about 45 seconds. But if you were waiting for us to, be a little more positive, talk a little bit about more what we've liked, what have you liked the most about this offseason for the Red Sox? What moves are you excited to see?
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like we've talked about both sides of it, where it's like there's good and maybe not so good things about most of the moves, except for the Devers, extension. I do think which is, uniformly positive. Everybody loves it. It was a great move and great contract, great for both the team and the player. I think that if I am looking at the stuff that I liked the most, I definitely do think I'm pretty in on Yoshida. I think that based off of and nothing that I've seen so far has of him actually playing in or him in spring training has dissuaded me from my thought that I just think he's, I don't know realistically if the power is going to translate as much because he did hit off. He did average like 23 homers a year the last 3 years or the last like 4 full seasons that he played in Japan. It's impressive. But I think that he's just going to be a transformative guy at the top of the order. I'm really happy that they identified somebody that they wanted and they spent the money to get that player, as opposed to, I think there were a few times this offseason where they had guys that they identified that they wanted, and a couple times they did give them the contract that they ended up getting, but the guys ended up signing to be closer to home, or they, for tax reasons, that kind of thing. They identified Yoshida as a guy that they wanted, and they went out and they outbid other teams. And there's this sort of, I think, perception in the industry that they way overpaid for him. I think a lot of that is sour grapes, in my opinion. I think I think it was Ian that said this on Chris and Ian's podcast, saying that the other 2 teams that really wanted Yoshida were Toronto and the Dodgers. And it's like, those teams are not considered dumb teams. The Red Sox just wanted
those
him
are very smart teams.
Exactly.
It's funny also because when people talk about Dombrowski, he overpays for the guys that he wants.
Exactly.
So you would think that there would be an appreciation for, they clearly wanted this guy, but because he doesn't have a track record in the US, it's that. And maybe he'll be more Kosuke Fukudome than Ichiro Suzuki, but
he was
you got to appreciate the commitment.
Yeah,
and the commitment.
Absolutely. I think that they scouted him heavily. They decided he was a good fit and they went for him. The other move that I just wanted to quickly to say as like a smaller scale move that I really liked, I touched on this before, which is that I thought the Red Sox did a really good job after the Story injury of pretty quickly figuring out how they were going to at least fill his hole in the lineup. And I think that the Duvall signing was a really good piece of business from the standpoint that it was a 1-year contract. It wasn't, it was, the $7 million base. I don't know. Are there incentives?
10 million max, I think.
10 million max for a guy who has a swing that's tailor-made for Fenway. And again, you look at what Story's offensive profile is, a lot of swing and miss, a lot of strikeouts, but a lot of power. Duvall is similar, probably more strikeouts, but potentially more power too. And that he could fill a need and play center field. He may be stretched playing center field close to every day. He's probably realistically, he's more of a corner infielder or a corner outfielder, but he can play center field. I thought that having that guy available on the market and being able to go to him and convince him and say, hey, come here, you're going to get to play center field. You're going to hit probably pretty close to the middle of the order. And he's another one of these like veteran glue guy types that seems like everybody really likes him. He's been on winning teams. He's a World Series champion. I thought as not like a huge move compared to the Devers signing or even the Yoshida signing. I thought that especially in the wake of losing Story, I thought that the Duvall signing was really was a very clutch signing, honestly. And then you couple that with the trade for Mondesi that happened around the same time.
There was a forgotten move in there a little bit too that I think when you talk about Duvall not necessarily being able to play center field, well, if that happens, they got Raimel Tapia, who can play a competent major league as a 4th outfielder. He can play a perfectly competent center field. So you have that. I think that they have, and I'm sorry I keep going back to my complaint about the infield, but I feel like they have really covered their bases with depth. They got Jorge Alfaro as a catcher if that doesn't work out. They still have Dahlbeck at first base if something happens with Casas. And, you're not thrilled about that, but he's somebody that has played there and has had some success. People forget just how strongly Dahlbeck finished the year in 2021 and how good he was when he first came
Last
up.
2 months of the year was great, yeah.
That hasn't gone anywhere. I think, and we haven't talked a lot about the struggles of Bobby and Jaron, but I think a lot of that was in their own head, and a lot of that had to do with the pressure that's been put on them. And, the more I hear with Cassis and what he had to go through when he went there, not, that he had to go through, that he basically had to deal with veterans being assholes. Like, that's not a Boston specific thing. But with them now being there for, this is going to be Bobby's third season. Jaron's, I think it's his second. No, it's supposed to be Bobby's fourth season.
Technically, yeah, right. Because he came up at the end of 2020.
Yeah, so they're a part of the culture now. That might make it easier for them, especially a guy like Duran who does seem to care about what other people think. Just when you see the anxiety that he's kind of had to deal with since his first two calls haven't gone that well.
Yeah.
And with Bobby, you could tell last year with like everything, like he just was really in his own head. It seemed like the entire season. They have depth. They really do, and like they've set themselves up very nicely.
It feels like a big difference from last year. Is that it does seem like with the pitching staff, both the defense and both the starting pitching and the bullpen, and then guys who have major league experience all over the diamond, they have done a really good job of setting themselves up for depth. They're setting themselves up, in case there are injuries in spring training. You said Tapia is somebody that would completely 100% fit as a competent MLB starting outfielder. Alfaro obviously is a competent starting MLB catcher, or not a starting catcher, but he can catch. Same thing with even having Nico Goodrum in camp and some of these other guys. There's a ton of pitching depth, like I said. So they're in a better spot to withstand injuries or even guys being ineffective compared to last season. And I'm with you as far as Duran goes. Like, I think that he clearly came into camp in great shape. I've really liked what I've seen from the change that he made to his swing, from what you've seen in like live batting practice and stuff like that, where he looks much more, his swing is much more compact. It's much more short to the ball. He's taking a shorter stride. It's all stuff that can help him. We'll see what happens in games, and he's going to be going to the World Baseball Classic for Mexico, assuming that he, I kind of questioned that decision at first. The more I think about it, I think it was smart for him to go, and I think he will get a good opportunity. They have a pretty good outfield on that team. They have Rosarena and Verdugo, obviously, too, but he knows that this is his, Duran and Dahlbeck both getting optioned late last year. I think you have to imagine that those were big wake-up calls for those guys of just like this, the dream of being in the big leagues is slipping, and I have to do everything I can to keep that dream alive. And I think both of those guys, we're going to see the best versions of them this spring training. And if it's not in Boston, maybe those guys showcase enough that another team that has a need, the Red Sox can get something. That was another big surprise this offseason, was that they weren't able to trade either Duran or Dahlbeck, considering the fact that they have better options at the major league level for both of those guys. And they both have years of service left. And it doesn't seem like, I don't know if they set too high of a price or they just didn't, other teams weren't as interested in them, but that could change if they both have big springs and other teams develop needs.
Yeah, no, suddenly they have the value that they had a couple of years ago. You can get something with that. It's funny with Dahlbeck too, because I had Rio Gomez on a few weeks ago, and they were teammates at U of A, and the way he described Bobby was that, he was just like the most natural baseball player he's ever seen. Everything came easy to him. So imagine you're kind of just cruising like that, and then you're experiencing really your first failure at such a big level. Like that's got to be tough to bounce back from. We'll see if you can.
Baseball is certainly a very humbling sport, and I think that you see that over and over again with guys that are hugely successful in amateur ball, or they're successful in the minors, and they get to the majors, and it just doesn't happen. And I think that, that's interesting, because Bobby is a great athlete. Like, there's no question that he can. And I'm excited to see him in spring training playing positions other than first base, which I don't know that people quite realize that Bobby didn't really play first base until he was in the majors. I mean, he was
an excellent fielding third baseman in the
right,
minors,
and he had to move because of Devers, and it's like there was but he's like, yeah, he's a great athlete. He could be, I think, and again, going back to, I think Ian has said this a lot on their podcast, that he kind of compares him to like a Dylan Moore type, where it's like, okay, this guy, he can do stuff. He could play around the diamond. He could get 300, 400 at bats. He's not going to play every day. He maybe will just play against lefties, but there is a role for a guy like Bobby Dahlbeck in the majors. And I think
you need guys like that.
Yeah. And he's athletic. It's just has to come down to, he has to get better at catching up to premium velocity with fastballs. He just, and especially against right-handers, because that's just what kills him. He can't catch up to major league caliber four-seamers. And if he can do that, then you have a major leaguer.
Yeah.
But
it's interesting that a lot of their top prospects have had that issue recently, because Duran had the same thing, but Michael Chavis couldn't catch up with the high fastball either for ages.
Never could.
Eventually he got traded to Pittsburgh, and I think he's with the Nationals now.
I was gonna say, yeah, I think he landed back with the Nationals. Maybe he'll have a shot again there.
One of the 18 ex Red Sox farm
right
now.
Jeter,
it's like
Downs,
Bad Ward, Joey Meneses, Jeter Downs ended up there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they all end up with the Nationals.
Yeah,
but well, this has been great having you on, Jake. Like, you definitely are gonna have to come back during the season to kind of see where these things where things end up going. And can you just plug your Twitter and your Medium account one more time?
Absolutely. It's at Jake T. O'Donnell on Twitter. A lot of baseball, a lot of music, a lot of, I do talk a lot of NBA also.
I was gonna say, I've seen some Celtics there.
Yeah, Celtic stuff there. And then my Medium is like medium.com/at Jake T. O'Donnell. There's actually one more thing I'd like to plug. And
let's do it.
My Instagram is also Jake T. O'Donnell, at Jake T. O'Donnell. And on my Instagram, I do I try to do it every week. I go on Instagram Live and I open old packs of baseball cards and talk about who's inside.
That's cool.
And what the reason why I do it is I kind of started doing it. It was right around the time the season started last year. It just kind of grew organically. I just was like, okay, I'm going to start doing this. I try to highlight a charity every week, and a good cause. And I've thought about doing it doing them on Twitter Live also. Maybe I'll jump on and do that. But yeah, I try to do that usually either when I did it last night, usually either do it Wednesday or Thursday nights. And yeah, just I've been since I've started it, I usually do packs of cards from like the late 80s, early 90s. And I've got a few packs recently that I'm going to try to open that are sort of more early 2000s, which is more of the, years that I was in high school. I've opened, I don't know how many packs I've opened, but I have pulled almost 40 Hall of Famers from the different packs that I've opened. I pulled an Edgar Martinez early card last night, which was cool. I've been opening 89 Upper Deck packs trying to get the Griffey rookie, and haven't been successful yet. But so that's something that I try.
That's going to be when you get it.
Yeah, I know. But yeah, so that's the same as my Twitter, Jake T. O'Donnell, for my Instagram. And yeah, like I said, I try to. I don't want to do it just to do it. I want to do it to sort of highlight good causes as well. And I've been highlighting some mental health organizations recently, and a lot of animal shelters and things like that. So that's a way that I try to do a good thing. So
good baseball guy, good person.
Thank you, Ed.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Jake. Thanks again so much. And we'll see. I think Hogdale, Brandon, and I are going to be doing. We're going to be back to our Sunday bullshit this weekend after the spring training game. So I guess we'll see you then. Till next time.
Right. Thanks.